Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, this is the ninth installment of the Lyceum debate series. Today, we have the debate on which is a better strategy for abolishing the state within the anarchist philosophical framework. Classic anarchism, which will be represented by Brenton Lengel, who is well known as a playwright and sci-fi stuff, and Keith Preston will be advocating pan-anarchism, and he runs Attack the System. So we will begin with you, Keith Preston. Your 10 minutes begin now.
Well, I've got four basic points I want to try to cover in the 10 minutes. And that is, first of all, what is anarchism? What's the definition of anarchism? What is pan-anarchism, as I understand it? What criticisms I might have of left anarchism, and what I think anarchists should be doing differently, or what I think anarchist priorities ought to be. As for the first question, what is anarchism? I hold to the dictionary definition of anarchism, or at least the definition you'd find in most anarchists or most dictionaries, which is the idea of a society without a state that's based on voluntary cooperation, voluntary association, things like that. So implied in that is a system of decentralized voluntary pluralism. And of course, there's a lot of anarchists who add on a lot of other qualifications. For example, everything must be organized as a direct democracy, or there can never be any kind of hierarchy, or there has to be a particular kind of economic system or distribution of resources, or there has to be a certain cultural outlook or a certain kind of inclusiveness, or and of course, some go even further and say, well, everybody has to be an atheist or vegan or pacifist or something like that. So you've got a lot of different sects of anarchism, obviously. Everybody that knows anything about anarchism is aware of that. Now, as far as pan-anarchism, it's fairly similar to the idea of ecumenicalism that you find in different religions. I guess you could, if I were a Muslim, I could say I'm a pan-Islamist, or if I were a Christian, I could say I'm a pan-Christian or something like that. But basically it's the idea of embracing the entire anti-authoritarian historical legacy, a lot of proto-anarchist ideas that you find in ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy and movements and things like that. There's some interesting work by anarchists like Peter Marshall's Demanding the Impossible and Max Natlau's History of Anarchism that go into this, and they talk about some of these prototypical anarchist thinkers and movements that existed in history. And of course, there's also a lot of cousin ideologies that are relatively similar to anarchism. For example, the philosophy of Henry David Thoreau, or the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, or even if you read Edmund Burke's Vindication of Natural Society, that's kind of a proto-anarchist document. So I tend to embrace all of these kinds of ideas. I guess you could, again, to use a religious analogy, it's kind of like the way the Muslims identify other religions, some of them as, people of the book, if they have these common Abrahamic traditions and things like that. So it's a similar concept. And I generally, have a sympathy for everyone who has an anti-authoritarian attitude, wherever they are and whatever they do. And again, to use another religious analogy, it's kind of like the Catholic idea of the doctrine of the anonymous Christian. The idea, well, even if you have somebody that's not a practicing Christian, if they act according to Christian virtues, they're an anonymous Christian. So I guess there's, the anonymous anarchist is what I'm referring to. Now, in terms of some of the criticisms that I have of left anarchism. First of all, I qualify that by saying that left anarchism, I certainly consider to be a legitimate form of anarchism. I'm not saying they're not true anarchists or anything like that. But I do see, though, that a lot of left anarchism strikes me as basically just the left wing of the Democratic Party. Now, that may be an overstatement, but I think only a partial one. It's not really a radical movement, or certainly not a revolutionary movement. In preparing for this conversation, I went and looked up some of the most popular left anarchist websites and looked over some of the articles and headlines and that kind of thing. And it struck me as kind of what, a parody of the Democratic Party would be in many instances, like something Rush Limbaugh might write if he wasn't an illiterate moron, parodying the Democratic Party. It's all the same kind of stuff. It's, how awful Donald Trump is, how awful Republicans are, how awful racism and sexism are. But the thing is that has nothing to do with anarchism. That's, a lot of people agree with that. So it's not by itself anything that stands out. I'd also say that left anarchism in its present form has no growth potential. Now, a lot of anarchists won't like this analogy, but I think it can be compared to a business. Like, let's say you have a business that sells a particular brand of shoes, and there's a niche market for that brand of shoes, and you're going to keep customers coming back for that brand of shoes decade after decade. But this brand of shoes has no appeal to anyone else anywhere. So there's no growth potential. It's just a niche market. And I think part of the problem there is a lot of anarchists tend to be very exclusionary. It's almost like many of them want to be as exclusionary as possible. And I don't mean just with people who aren't anarchists or people that they have views that they really find objectionable. And I'm talking about even with each other. Like, I don't know how many anarchist events, left anarchist events I've heard of where there was a fist fight or a shouting match and things like that, you know, where there's actual physical violence and disruptive behavior going on because somebody's getting labeled a fascist or sexist or something else. So I think I see that as a problem. And then another issue is within left anarchism, I see a lot of seeds for a whole new kind of authoritarianism. Like, you know, some of the things are more obvious, the kind of censorious, kind of politically correct, as it's commonly called, outlook. This call-out culture thing is something I also find fairly troubling. It strikes me as a snitch culture. It's almost like something I would compare to, say, the prototypical Stasi or something like that. Also, the interest in vigilante violence against people that are considered unprogressive, I think, is a problem. And I see that as an issue as well. You know, I see all these different kinds of things, political correctness, this kind of moral crusading you see with some of these social justice warrior people or whatever you want to call them, call-out culture, vigilante violence. I see all of that as containing the seeds of a whole new kind of authoritarianism, you know, the future Cheka or whatever. Now, in terms of what I would do differently, I think that priorities for anarchists, like anybody else, any other kind of radicals, should vary according to circumstances. I think I might take different views if I was, say, in China than if I was in the United States. But I think, particularly in the United States, anti-imperialism is a primary value, because the United States government is not just the government of the United States, it's the de facto government of the world. It's certainly the world's leading death machine at this point in history. It's killed arguably 1 million people or more around the world in the last 20 years alone, and a lot more going back over the past few decades. Interestingly about that, this is a thought experiment I would put out. Let's say you had a university campus somewhere, and somebody from the alt-right was going to be speaking on a Tuesday night, like Richard Spencer, and then the ambassador from Saudi Arabia was going to be speaking on Wednesday night. Who would the left anarchists be more inclined to go out and protest against? You know, Richard Spencer, this guy that's this, Richard Spencer, this guy that's got some, ideas of his own that people find offensive, or the ambassador from Saudi Arabia, a representative of a state that's actually committing genocide. So I think there's a lack of focus and priorities there, I think. In fact, one of the leading complaints that a lot of the left anarchists have against the mainstream society is that they feel there's an excess of racism in the mainstream society. But if we want to talk about the slaughter and murder of people with dark skin, look around the world and look at the American Empire. I mean, that's the real source of oppression of brown people or dark-skinned people around the world. So I think there's a lack of focus there. I also think the fight against the state itself is something that a lot of anarchists don't really pay much attention to. In fact, I see a lot of literature, ironically, put out by right-wing libertarian groups and even some conservative groups that are far more critical of the state than I see in a lot of left anarchist material. I mean, a lot of left anarchist material certainly criticizes the state, but it's always very selective. It's always, well, the cops are assholes because they beat us up at a demonstration, or the ICE is racist and things like that. And all of those things may be true. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that, but I do see that there's not much attention being paid to the wider role of the state in fostering oppression on a more general level. And this is something that also cuts across conventional boundaries. The police state that's taken root in the United States in recent decades is something that cuts across boundaries of race, class, gender, religion, all these different things. It affects some people more than others, but it affects people at all levels of society to some degree. There's also the question of economics. I generally see left anarchists taking fairly shallow views on economics. Like I've always said, they're really just anarcho-social democrats. I don't think they really have developed much in the way of a critique of the way that the role of the state in centralizing control over wealth and resources and property. I think that's something that's really missing there. Even some of the leading lights among left anarchists, like Noam Chomsky, is like this. He's better than some of the others, but I really see most left anarchists are really just social democrats under another name. when it comes to some of the cultural politics, like again, the left anarchists, like most other Western leftists, they seem to put the cultural politics and identity politics and the lifestyle radicalism and all of that kind of stuff. They tend to put that out in front. You know, the race, gender, gay, you know, as well as social issues, you know, environmentalism, animal rights. The problem I have with some of that is, outside of any kind of context of a critique of the state or class analysis, a geopolitical analysis, where does identity politics get you? Where does cultural politics get you? It gets you Barack Obama. It gets you Hillary Clinton. It gets you the guy that's the new CEO of Dow Chemical now. These are
You're out of time now, Keith.
Huh?
You're out of time now.
Oh, okay.
So just FYI, this hasn't happened yet. But for better sound quality on everybody's end, if you're not talking, please mute yourself. Now it is Brent. Your 10 minutes of opening statement begins now.
Awesome. So I'm Brenton Lengel. I've been involved with anarchism since about 2010. I was heavily involved with Occupy Wall Street in New York. I've written for another number of anarchist publications and been interviewed. And today I am making the case for classical anarchism, which is kind of a strange place to be as an anarchist, to where I'm kind of arguing for tradition with an ideology that is inherently iconoclastic, and I'm going to be arguing for a slightly more uniform approach in certain ways to an ideology and people who are by temperament. I think it's been compared to herding cats. So what do I define as anarchism? I use a variation on the Noam Chomsky definition, which is the idea that the burden of proof on those who demand hierarchical privileges for themselves or others rests on them. So I'm not necessarily against all hierarchy, and classical anarchism has never been against all hierarchy. It's a big misconception that people have because of, I guess, sort of pop culture-y ideas of what it is. But I mean, you go back to 1871 with Mikhail Bakunin, straight off the bat, he says, you know, I'm very much for the authority of the bootmaker in the matter of boots and the engineer in the matter of engineering, but I don't let the bootmaker or the engineer impose their authority on me in external circumstances. I listen to them freely and with due consideration, and reserve for myself always the uncontested right of censure. So, I mean, I think that anarchism as a tendency in people is the tendency to be, I suppose, skeptical of power. Skeptical of the solidification of political institutions and individuals into positions where their whims and decisions hold more power than your average person. And the whole philosophy of left anarchism really, in a lot of ways, and in a funny way, actually does mirror part of the American government, because the American government was based partially on the Iroquois Confederacy, which some people consider a proto-anarchist group. So the idea of separation of powers. And a lot of anarcho-socialism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism focuses on that aspect. However, I really think that anarchism, if we're going to talk about it in anything other than a negative sense, because I don't think it's a good idea for things to be purely negative. You can't really unite people around a negative. Negative can get a bunch of people angry, but really it is a positive proposition that people tend to really cling to. And I found that in my professional life and in my personal life. At the moment, the type of anarchism that I think is most effective, just historically speaking, has been the anarcho-syndicalist and anarcho-communist traditions, which has appeared in numerous places throughout the world. There was the Black Army, led by Nestor Makhno in the Ukraine, which Todd and I have talked about it, and he's had some issues. But The Black Army was a very, very effective fighting force, if nothing else, and served as a great means of organization among the peasants, to where they were actually not only able to control their territory and hold off both the Red and the White armies, but they actually dealt the death blow to the Tsarist forces in the Russian Civil War, and then were, of course, undone by treachery from the Bolsheviks. We never learn. Flash forward to 1930s Catalonia, and you have anarcho-syndicalists and anarcho-communists through the FI and the CNT. I mean, that model ran whole cities, and not just cities, but like whole regions. They were able to unify and defeat a modern mechanized army in Spain, in one of the richest countries in the world at the time, with a handful of farmers and factory workers armed with like antique rifles and weapons left over from World War I that they'd been able to scrounge in like improvised devices and armor. So, I mean, again, we've seen the power of this organizing principle. And like the Ukraine, it wasn't a breakdown of leadership or organization that undid the anarchists, nor was it a creeping kind of Bolshevik authoritarianism. It was, once again, treachery from the Bolsheviks and the Western liberal world's preference at the time to fascism, to what the anarchists were, offering, which was very ironic in the sense that, again, I think there's a lot of very specific American values and Western values that are exemplified in the left anarchist tradition, namely liberty, autonomy, and equality. These are all good, solid liberal values that liberalism does not fail to live up to, and anarchism really has been able to. And then you even look forward to the Zapatistas in Chiapas. You look at the Recovered Factories movement in Chile, Argentina, and of course, most recently, you have the PKK-YPG in Kurdistan, who were some of the most effective forces against ISIS. And in fact, we're finally, in almost a repeat of history, we're backed by Western powers, and we're able to hold their territory. Now, what's going to happen with that, stands to, we'll wait and see. I know Turkey's waiting to pounce on them the second that they no longer have United States troops there, and there may even possibly be a deal with Assad. But the thing is that with this particular tradition, however you want to do it, in this tendency, I think we have seen the most valuable means of fighting the state, and not just the state, but the overall culture of capitalism, this society that we find ourselves in, which, for all of its virtues, at this point really isn't working for us. I mean, we've been seeing markets get even more volatile. You mentioned Donald Trump, and clearly the United States government does not represent the will of even anywhere close to the majority of citizens. So there's a lot of us, and I think me and Keith, and Todd, we're looking for a new way and a better way to live. And, that was one of the big messages of Occupy Wall Street, was another world is possible. And you hear that echoed throughout the world from anarchist Buenaventura Durruti, who defeated the fascist forces in Spain and died fighting in Madrid against Franco, to Emma Goldman. There is a definite political tradition that can be drawn all the way starting at the Paris Commune, where a lot of liberalism's ideas really made their way out during the French Revolution, and going up until today. So I feel like what's very important, and what we have to be very careful about when we talk about anarchism, is that we don't talk about it in negative terms as much as possible, because those terms can get very, very muddy. I think anarchism, the political movement, is distinct from anti-statism. And then the other thing that I think is really, really important that we focus on is what's called recuperation. The society that we live in, for all of its faults, is exceptionally good at defeating challenges to its power. Be those challenges material, with militaristic, or be they ideological challenges. And one of the big things with recuperation is, when you look in the store at Urban Outfitters and you see the Che Guevara image on a T-shirt being sold for like, $60 to someone who, honestly is probably part of the bourgeoisie or the petite bourgeoisie and doesn't really—
1 minute left.
Yeah, thank you. And doesn't really understand. There's also kind of a danger in swallowing, I guess, a poison pill of specific anarchist philosophies that are anarchist primarily in name. I don't like to say this with ANCAPs because a lot of ANCAPs actually are anarchists by temperament, but their ideology, a lot of the time, if you go by the Rothbardians and especially the Hoppians, I mean, that can be traced directly to Batistat, who was directly in conflict with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the man who created political anarchism. So in a lot of ways, I think if you look at Murray Rothbard's writing early on, you see him saying that right libertarians are not anarchists. And then you see him say, well, we did a really good job capturing the word libertarian. And then you see him later on go, hey, I'm founding anarcho-capitalism. So to maintain our soul, we sometimes have to sometimes we have to say no. And so that's why I think that we need to stick with the historical understanding of anarchism as much as possible.
All right, Keith, you get 5 minutes of rebuttal starting now.
Well, honestly, there's not a whole lot to rebut of what I just heard because 99% of it I actually agree with. But what I will touch on the last couple of points that I did have a kind of a quibble with, and that's the relationship between anarchism and anti-statism. I would agree that there are certainly a lot of people who think ill of the state who wouldn't reasonably be considered anarchists, and they wouldn't think of themselves as anarchists. They wouldn't want to be labeled anarchists. For example, you even have some throne and altar royalists who dislike the modern state, the modern bourgeois nation state. They prefer the old pre-modern system, the medieval system. But I do think, though, that there is within the spectrum of political philosophies and political opinions a whole lot of, as I said earlier in the introduction, cousin ideologies or cousin philosophies. And that is, you do have a lot of people that do have an instinctive anti-authoritarian attitude, even if they don't identify as anarchist. One example, one guy I would cite as an example is Gore Vidal, the late Gore Vidal, the writer. Now, he never identified as an anarchist. He, I think, was basically just a liberal most of his life. But if you read the stuff that the guy wrote, a lot of his political criticism and social criticism and cultural criticism, he had very anti-authoritarian attitudes and values and things like that. Another one was Bertrand Russell, who was a lifelong liberal and democratic socialist. Now, these are guys from the left, but you can find people who come from a more rightward-leaning background as well that I would say overlap very well with the anarchist tradition. One example is Bill Kaufman, who's sort of a right-leaning, right-libertarian, right-populist writer. He writes for the American Conservative and some of those kinds of magazines. He's an example of someone from the right that I think overlaps very well with anarchism. So the problem that I see with a lot of the left anarchists is that they're about drawing as narrow a circle as possible. A good example was a few years ago, I saw a review of the Peter Marshall book I mentioned earlier, Demanding the Impossible. For listeners that aren't familiar with that, it's a very lengthy 800 and some page long history of anarchism, but it actually goes back and examines all the proto-anarchist philosophers from the ancient world, going all the way back to ancient China and Greece and through the Middle Ages and all of that. And he also he talks about early libertarian thinkers, and then he talks about a lot of modern thinkers that overlap with anarchism, like he talks about Foucault and thinkers of that type as well. And I saw a review of this on I won't mention what site it was, but it was a popular left anarchist, anarcho-communist website. And they were really bashing this book, saying, what an awful book this is. How dare you discuss Nietzsche in a book about anarchism? Or how dare you discuss, Foucault or John Locke or somebody like that? And my reaction to that is, well, this is like some sectarian religious track I'm reading here. This is like, well, all these other churches over here that have existed for the last 2,000 years, we don't want anything to do with with them. You know, it's our little sect that's on the right page, and that's all we care about, and forget all these other people. And regrettably, I see that kind of thinking all the time among left anarchists. I mean, left anarchists aren't the only people who do this. There's people in all kinds of political philosophies and ideologies and movements that do this. So I'm not saying that, you know, left anarchists are some special class of miscreants when it comes to this, but I do see this happening all the time, in the sense of, well, you know, these post-left anarchists, we don't want anything to do with them, or these syndicalists, we don't want anything to do with them, or these primitivists, we don't want anything to do with them, or you know, or particularly when you have any kind of anarchist that overlap with the right, you know, the anarcho-capitalists, the national anarchists, or any of that, we don't want anything to do with them. You know, they're awful. I don't really think that drawing a narrow circle like that is a good plan if you want to promote anti-authoritarian values. I would prefer drawing a wide circle. I mean, there's got to always be limits, but I prefer a wide circle. And I actually agree with many of the criticisms that left anarchists have of thinkers like Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe, although I would flip that and say, while the problem I see with anarcho-capitalism is I'm not sure how you prevent it from becoming capital C capitalism as opposed to the anarcho kind of capitalism. But I see the same problem with anarcho-communism. How are you going to prevent that from becoming stiffening and crystallizing into capital C communism as well? Or syndicalism, how are you going to prevent these labor organizations from becoming monopolies and all of that? So I'm actually more, I suppose I'm somewhat agnostic on the economic questions. My own views tend to be something of a hybrid of all those tendencies, but I do see some problems there as well.
All right. Okay, so Brenton, your 5 minutes of rebuttal begin now.
Yeah, well, actually, that was really refreshing, because I'd say I agreed with about 90% of what you said there, too. So I would say overall, you know, there were a lot of things brought up initially in the objection to classical anarchism. And I really think that a lot of this is not necessarily part of classical anarchism. I think they're parts of activist culture. And there are a lot of classical anarchists who are activists, but it's not exactly the same thing. You know, I took a couple of notes here. The exclusionary and the drawing of the, you know, permanently tightening circle until you're sitting down. It's like three white men in a room shouting white privilege at each other in a circle. You know, this stuff definitely does happen. It's really annoying. And it is not helpful at all. I would say also, you know, quickly to the points of fist fights and disruption, you know, I was at Occupy, and, you know, half the time there's a fist fight or a disruption, it's somebody being an idiot. And half the time it's like actually a police infiltrator and informant. Like I've seen weird stuff like that happen. So you got to deal with crazy people, you got to deal with infiltrators, and I think a friend of mine at Occupy Wall Street actually said, the reporter asked him, like, what's the worst thing about Occupy? And he said, crackheads and Democrats. And I felt like that was like really, really the case. I was really surprised to hear that we were kind of looked at by some as the left wing of the Democratic Party. I've heard anarchists accuse the CPUSA of essentially being edgy Democrats. And I think there is some overlap. But like, for instance, myself, like I have voted Democrat in the past, but since I started out on the right, and my period as like an actual like card carrying Democrat, like I still vote in the primaries, but that ended, you know, that was like 2008 to 2010. I have a lot of overlap, but honestly, before that, I was a young Republican. I grew up in college. I was a libertarian because I didn't hate gays, but I still kind of liked the way we did things economically. I think kind of overall, the other thing that I wanted to sort of bring up is state versus government. And this is less of a quibble and more of clarifying an issue. Usually right libertarians and left libertarians mean different things when we talk about the state and government, and often we mean the inverse things. Usually what left-wing anarchists have an issue with is the military and the police. That's really what we consider the state to be, the physical organization that functions in a hierarchical manner and exists to essentially enforce property rights on behalf of the ruling class, not everyone, though they will claim to support everyone in order to gain ideological legitimacy. A lot of anarchists, left anarchists, don't have as much of a problem with government, the city council, the actual politicians themselves. Like, we may be angry at the specific government we deal with because a lot of them are absolutely horrid, but the actual physical ability to engage in government, which is to say, come together, talk about policy, mediate it, and create it, that's the far less, in my mind, that's the far less insidious function of the state, if you want to consider the military and the government the same thing. A military without a government to guide it is a junta. It's like one of the absolute worst forms of dictatorship you can have. A government without a military is a suggestion box, essentially. So I feel...
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, thank you. So I feel like I wanted to address that. On the aspect of political correctness, and I really hear a lot of people talking about this, I think that the anarchist tendency to want to stick up for people who are marginalized and cannot defend themselves pushes, or cannot defend themselves as well, pushes anarchists in that way. If we see someone being unfairly discriminated against, we want to do something to change it. And there are systems of power based around identity in society, just like there are systems of power based around money, and they should be eliminated. You mentioned anti-imperialism, and I'm 100% behind you, though I will say that I think if the United States was not in control of the world, a lot of the people that the United States is killing, other people would be killing them or killing others. I think homo homini lupus. My one big point on Islam... Yeah, very quickly. Islam versus Fash. We've got a whole military and police force going after Islam and so-called radical Islam. We've got people going into that. Like, people are ignoring fascists, and at the moment they are the much bigger threat to American civilians. So, I mean, I would say I would have issues with Islamic theocrats, but the more important problem that is not being addressed would be somebody like Richard Spencer.
Okay, so Keith, your 10 minutes of cross-examination of Brenton begin now. Did you hear me?
I'm not hearing Keith. His
Keith,
mic is still on.
Okay, my mic was still muted, sorry. All right, well, I'll start by, I'll address some of the points, or maybe ask some questions about some of the points that Brent just raised. When it comes to the question of state versus government, I do understand that argument. I do understand that there's a difference between the Pentagon and the city council and things like that. In fact, there are some anarchists who at times have accused me of statism because they say I'm too much of a city statist or a village fascist or something like that. But I do think that matters of scale matter. I do think that, you know, a continent-wide nation state like the United States is certainly going to be something that's much more pernicious and much more destructive than the city council. Now, that's not to say that local governments can't be tyrannical or authoritarian or whatever, but on the grand scale of things, what would you see as a greater problem? Would you see something like a narrow-minded, you know, closed local community, you know, a stereotype of what a 1950s, you know, exclusionary Ozzie and Harriet type of community? Would you see that as a greater threat because there tends to be a lot of, you know, exclusionary cultural values there? Or would you see something like what we have now, which is this continent-wide state that is liberal in many respects, but is also very imperialistic, very militaristic, very centralist, very authoritarian, has this very large police state, this very huge socioeconomic disparity? Which would you see as a greater threat or a greater danger or a greater problem?
Well, in a funny way, this kind of goes back to my Buddhism. Actually, I'm a Nichiren Buddhist, and I'd actually say they're both the same problem in a certain way, because the personal is political and the external world is a reflection of our own internal world. Now, to put that into materialist terms, they are both big problems, but they're big problems in different ways. one small isolated community is not so much of an issue in a vacuum. But the problem is that humans are extremely suggestible. And ideas can really move through us like waves. I think, I hate to quote Jordan Peterson, but he said that people don't possess ideas, ideas possess people. And we take, what I think he meant by that, the charitable thing of that, I don't think he means that ideas literally control folks, but instead we take social cues on how we should treat other people from those around us. You know, I mean, even look at somebody like Stalin. Stalin, yeah, he got to the top of the USSR and purged a ton of people, was one of the most evil human beings in all of history. But where did he come from? He came from a environment where he was beaten by his father. He came from a highly repressive environment. So I think a lot of the time, smaller problems, what seems to be a small problem, can actually be much bigger on a larger scale because it affects the human heart and the human psyche. Now, if you put a gun to my head and you say which is worse, a town being ignorant or like the entire freaking United States, obviously like this giant method of you know, essentially deploying violence and securing resources is the more dangerous one. I mean, we live in a world with nuclear weapons. So I would say, you know, since if the US and Russia decide to duke it out, we could literally all die. Yeah, okay, that's more dangerous.
Yeah, well, plus it wasn't Ohio that was responsible for the Vietnam War or the war in Iraq either. So, but one thing I'd like to clarify, because you were making a point that I found interesting at the end, and you kind of ran out of time, and you were talking about Islamists versus fascists, and I didn't quite understand what the point was you were making. Could you clarify that?
Sure. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself. So, you know, fascism right now is the #2 domestic terror threat in the United States, but by the numbers, post-2001. Now, if you include 2001, obviously Islamic terrorism jumps up there, but I don't normally include that because it's such a, it's like drawing 5 royal flushes in a row. We're not really that in danger of being killed by jihadi terrorists. I mean, technically, we're more in danger of being killed by our own cops or on our own furniture, but people are still like very afraid of that. You know, there have been a number of murders by white nationalists throughout the year. I was on RT talking about this with Anthony Bryan Logan, and you know, there was the guy, Adam Wathan, building bombs in Florida. You've got the guy in New York who was just charged with terrorism that killed a random black gentleman with a sword. You got that guy, Jeremy Christian, who killed those 2 men on a train when they tried to stop him from menacing some teenagers. The only group that kills more in the United States than white nationalists is actually sovereign citizens, and they almost exclusively kill cops. So you can say that white nationalists and fascists are the #1 threat, terror threat to American citizens. Now, we've got this huge military industrial complex that is dedicated since 9/11 to attacking the Islamic world, to fighting these terrorists. And I think in a lot of times it's massive overkill and it's more trouble than it's worth. At the same time, you know, it's only recently that our institutions have started to respond to fascism, and a lot of people in these institutions are, you know, somewhat sympathetic to fascists. Or what is the lyric from with Rage Against the Machine? Some of those who work forces are the same that burn crosses. You know, we just had the Christchurch shooting, and it's getting worse and worse every year. So, you know, I can't solve every single problem in the world. And if I give voice to anti-Islamic sentiments at times, that voice may be used by the American empire in a small way to justify going over to, you know, Palestine and letting Netanyahu bomb the hell out of Gaza. You know, so I don't want to contribute to that narrative. But, you know, like at the same time, I'm not going to say that I don't have very serious problems with jihadi or even like extremely conservative Islam. I'm a Buddhist. I have a lot of issues with anybody that slanders the Lotus Sutra, and I would definitely consider jihadists some of the biggest slanderers in the world.
Right. Well, I think one point you raised was the issue of activist culture, and you were saying that some of the problems that I identified in activist culture, I would agree that that's not inherent to left anarchism itself. Like, you can be a left anarchist and not exhibit some of those problems. But what would you do differently then? Like, a lot of the problems that you've identified in activist culture, what do you think is inherently problematic about activist culture that contributes to this, and what would you prefer to do differently?
I think there's a lot of problems with it. One of the big ones is that we do not come from a place of compassion. In a lot of ways, people who get radicalized on the far right or the far left, a lot of the times these are very angry people. I was definitely very angry, and at my most radical point, I was extremely depressed. And it took me a while to realize that and to deal with it. And I really feel like a lot of the time people fall into what's referred to in Buddhism. Activists will jump. So, without getting too much into the weeds here, there's 10 basic life conditions called the 10 worlds in Buddhism. The 6 lower ones are ones that humans run into, and the 4 higher ones are like Buddhists liberating themselves from that. And people will tend to gravitate towards one life condition or another from time to time. The 2 life conditions that I see activists in most are hell, which is a condition of total claustrophobic aggression, where they feel that the environment around them is threatening and they feel very little freedom of movement, choice. And then on top of that, then there is the world of asuras, or anger, which is where you have this, I guess, the I'm better than you, holier than thou attitude that people get, where folks will jump into this headspace and they will appear as righteous. But in reality, what this is it's kind of it's a trick. They don't realize necessarily that they're doing it. But the trick is to gain power and respect for themselves because they are insecure and don't feel together. So, I mean, what would I do? I'd introduce Buddhism first off. I do a lot with Soka Gakkai and the Nichiren human revolution approach. But more than that, to put it in activist language, is I would really try to help people realize that solidarity means, having compassion for people, meeting them where they're at, and listening to them, genuinely listening to what they have to say, rather than shouting at them and telling them, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you're problematic. I mean, there's a lot of people who genuinely are just trying to troll and disrupt. You have to deal with them. But there's a lot of people that just either don't understand or are rough around the edges. And, some people take advantage of that to make themselves feel better. And I think it's really awful.
I'm going to step in here, and since Keith's time is up, you can just continue any sort of questions you have for Keith now, Brent, beginning now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a couple down here. So could you elaborate maybe a little bit on, I guess, hang on, have I not? Anti-imperialism, because I think that this is something that's really key to take in, because we do find ourselves in the quote-unquote most powerful nation in the world, nuclear weapons. I mean, how would you, here's the issue with imperialism, and this is one of the problems that I've had with dealing with the state and nuclear weapons. There's a specific reason why the nation state replaced the feudal empire, and that is that large armies suddenly were able to defeat castles because of the cannons and artillery. And because of this, what happened was that the groups that could afford to field large armies by taxing large populations were the ones that survived and expanded. And the ones that either were unable or unwilling to do that were the ones that were conquered and forced into, and here we find ourselves. So as far as imperialism goes, I would ask you about your, for an anti-imperialist, for somebody who has issues with the way that the United States has conducted itself as it, since the Second World War and before. Like, how do we oppose that while at the same time not opening up for another empire to come in and fill that power vacuum, or allowing ourselves to be, I guess, manipulated by other imperial interests, namely, not to sound all Democrat, but namely, Russians, the Chinese. I'm not saying they're necessarily our enemies, but they have a lot of power, and they are looking to expand. So what's your thought on that?
A few points. As far as the current world order, I do see the world order we have now as essentially being a singular empire, and that's a global capitalist empire, of which what I call it the Anglo-Israeli-Saudi axis is the dominant faction, all right, which is America, its allies in Europe and the Middle East, basically, and East Asia to some degree. I'm not somebody that deifies or demonizes Russia or China. I don't like either of those states. I think they're authoritarian and reactionary and all of that. But I tend to see them as backwater provinces in the global system. I mean, it's like they're basically third world countries with nuclear weapons, and the fact that they have nukes matters. But other than that, I don't really think they're that important. Now, there's a movement called Eurasianism that is popular among some on the far left and some on the far right as well, that advocates a type of counter-imperialism. I don't consider them to be anti-imperialist. They're more counter-imperialist, and they want to have this kind of Eurasian imperial alliance that's led usually by Russia against the West. Now, I see that as just a trying to reinvigorate the Cold War, only from the other side. So I'm not in favor of that either. What I am in favor of is something kind of like the old non-aligned movement that still technically exists, but during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement emerged in the early 60s as an alliance of nations that were opposed to both sides in the Cold War. It was led by countries like Nasser's Egypt and Nehru's India and Tito's Yugoslavia and some others. Now, it didn't always live up to its ideals. It had Saudi Arabia in it, which is an American puppet state, and had Cuba in it, which was a Soviet puppet state. And I'm not for states anyway. I mean, my version of a non-aligned movement would be more about groups and people everywhere seeking independence and autonomy and anti-authoritarian values and things like that, not just self-determination for states. But that kind of approach, this kind of global solidarity against the global empire, is really the model that I hold to, not defending other states that are supposedly anti-imperialist somewhere around the world. Now, there might be pragmatic circumstances in which that might be necessary, but the non-aligned movement's model, I think, is really the model that I adhere to, with the qualification that it's not just about national states, it's about independence for everyone. In fact, I'd say a serious anti-imperialism has to have as its first starting point a pro-indigenous people outlook. Because if you're not pro-indigenous people, then you're not anti-imperialist. There's a whole lot of states around the world that say, well, we don't want the Americans or the Russians or whomever interfering in our state so we can oppress our indigenous people or whatever. I'm not certain enough of that either. So I think indigenous people's rights is really the first order of business when it comes to anti-imperialism. And then from there, something kind of like the non-aligned movement model.
Sweet. Yeah, that sounds great. I don't know much about the non-aligned movement. I'll have to look into that. But I tend to be very I tend to be very interested in any kind of political movement that has been able to, I guess, advance a humanist cause and kind of get people to back off when they're getting ready to scrap. Because, as I've said before, I think the number one threat to the planet is nuclear weapons, and kind of the number two threat to the planet is capitalist industry. And that, I think, is the second question that I would have, because, if we're trying to come up with anti-state, an anti-state society, a society where we can all be free to express ourselves and to be who we are and to help everybody around us. One of the things we really have to look out for, I think, is, people who want to take advantage of that for their own ends. Because, you know, I won't, once again, homo homini lupus, I won't pretend that the world is like a gumdrop fairy tale for us where we can all, you know, traipse through it. But at the same time, you know, I do think the people that want to do harm to others are few and far between. And I also think that a lot of the time, a lot of antisocial activity is incentivized. My question is this: how would we deal with something like global climate change, where you know, the actual industries that we are going after at this point are causing you know, famines and exacerbating wars? Climate change is perhaps partially to blame for the Syrian civil war. How do you do that without a state structure, without the power to deal with it? Not that the state is dealing with it, but, you know, to affect that from a grassroots level is a very difficult problem that I have, you know, trouble wrapping my head around, to be completely honest.
Well, two things there. First, as far as the question of anti-statism, I tend to agree that anti-statism in a vacuum is problematic, because you can just as easily end up with the Republicans if you go in that direction. I mean, what do? They say, oh, we're against big government. What does that mean? That means, well, we cut taxes and regulation at the top, we cut some benefits from the bottom, you know, we raise deficits and call ourselves fiscal conservatives. You know, it's just, you know, they've turned big government anti-statism into a scam, is what I'm saying. This is simply used to promote the interest of the right wing of the ruling class. So I do agree that anti-statism outside of any kind of context at all is problematic. Now, on the question of the environment, I don't think there's any one solution to environmental problems. There may be some environmental problems that there's no solution to. I think that's one possibility. But it's also true that I don't think there's any one solution to environmental problems. I think that it depends on what kind of environmental issues you're talking about. Now, there are a lot of environmental issues that are more regional issues or local issues than global issues per se. One is a good example is the problem in Flint, Michigan recently with the poisoned drinking water and things like that. Around the world, you have a lot of local problems like that, or regional environmental problems that aren't necessarily global crisis issues, but they're serious local crisis issues. And I think there's different ways of dealing with those in different contexts, and the solutions don't, you know, there's no one universal solution, is what I'm saying. As far as climate change, the main issues there are, you know, if the goal is to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, I tend to be skeptical. What's that?
I was just saying 1 minute.
Okay, I tend to be skeptical as to whether we have the technology at present to completely convert to sustainable energy, solar and wind and that kind of stuff. I'm not sure that a lot of the plans that I see like that, I've had people I know who are into environmentalism that explain that to me, and a lot of it sounds like science fiction. So ultimately, I think that we're caught between a rock and a hard place. It's either fossil fuels or it's nuclear power, both of which have their problems. I think we can have some fossil fuels, reduce the use of fossil fuels by expanding the use of nuclear power. We don't have to have total nuclear power, but we do have to have, we can have some of these other alternative forms of energy as well. But I think we're stuck with either fossil fuels or nuclear power for the time being, or some of both. But I think that likewise, I think those are local issues to a large degree as well. I think I see that being worked out in different kinds of communities and regions on a worldwide basis, rather than something that's being imposed on a global basis. There was this thing a few years ago. Right.
So this is the final stretch. So Keith, your 5 minutes closing statement begins now.
Well, I don't know that I have really disagreed quite a bit with what Brent has said. I mean, most of what Brent has said I would agree with. I think maybe a few other quibbles might be that when it comes to the question of right-wing terrorism, I do think a lot of people on the left exaggerate that. Now, that's not to say that when situations like that happen, that it's not terrible, like the thing that happened in New Zealand recently and things like that. No reasonable person disagrees that that's a terrible thing. But I tend to see those as more isolated criminal problems, just like we have white supremacist types that commit terrible crimes. We have mentally ill people who commit terrible crimes like that. We have people who are having a bad day who commit mass shootings. There are Islamists that commit crimes of that type. There have been terrorists of other ideologies that have done stuff similar to that. I was looking at some research recently that showed that in the year 2017 in the United States, there were 17,284 homicides, and only about 35 of those were traceable to political terrorists, and only about half of those traceable to white supremacists. And in some of those, it was the white supremacist person who was either the victim, a murder victim, they were killed by another white supremacist, or they were involved in a robbery or a drug deal gone bad. So I don't see that as being an epidemic. I think it's more of a situation like the school shootings. You know, we don't really have the epidemic of public shootings or school shootings that a lot of people think we have. They're rare when they happen, but they're dramatic and they're awful and they're highly publicized. And I think, and I'd say the same thing about Islamic terrorism for the most part as well, although that's somewhat larger on a worldwide basis. So another thing is on the question of political correctness. One thing we didn't really get into is I do see that kind of ideological framework being incorporated into the state's ideology. There was actually a paper published on that, an academic paper published recently. In fact, it just came out a few days ago by Dennis Rankert, who's a Canadian academic, who is talking about how things like anti-racism, gender equity, climate change, all of these things have actually been incorporated into the state's ideology. And he's talking about how this has happened since the end of the Cold War, where it's no longer anti-socialism or anti-communism that's really the driving ideological force of Western capitalism. Instead, they've taken all of these ostensibly progressive ideas and incorporated them into their own ideological framework, what the Marxists call the superstructure. So I do think that a lot of people on the left look at political correctness and they say, well, what's so bad about standing up for marginal communities that have been oppressed and things like that? But there's this lengthy history, going back for centuries, of states and ruling classes co-opting ideas like that and incorporating them into their own ideological framework and bending them for their own purposes. There's also the issue of how movements and organizations and peoples and groups that were once out of power, when they become powerful, they often create a new ruling class, a new system of authority, a new state, a new system of oppression. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. I mean, anarchists are familiar with that, but in terms of with the Russian Revolution and all the communist revolutions, where the first thing they did was they shot the anarchists. So that kind of thing is something I see going on today on a more, in a less immediately extreme form with some of this political correctness stuff. I see some of that stuff being incorporated by the system and being incorporated into the system as part of its ideology. I do think, though, that when it comes to anti-imperialism, that I would like to see anarchists paying more attention to things like what is going on in Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Like, Saudi Arabia is a state that is aligned with the United States. It largely exists because of the United States. Even Trump said recently they'd be finished in a week if it weren't for the support the Americans give them. Right now, the Saudis are carrying out a genocide in Yemen. It's probably the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. That and the Rohingya in South Asia, probably the two worst situations like that. And all of this is done with the backing of the American government. And I don't see a whole lot of people from the progressive left, anarchist, socialist, whatever wing of the spectrum talking much about this. I mean, it's just sort of another issue alongside, clean air and recycling and all the kinds of other things that progressives get into. So I do think that anti-imperialism is a priority issue and a serious, triage issue, if you will, in the present system.
All right. So, Brenton, your 5 minutes concluding statement begins now.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think I disagree with Keith on too much. What I will say is that anti-imperialism, you may not be seeing that on the left because you're paying attention to the left anarchists. A lot of, I hate to say it, but the Marxists are the ones who are very, they're paying attention to Saudi Arabia. In fact, a friend of mine, Caleb Maupin, who works for RT, he's constantly talking about it. So, it is being done. I think it's just because of the circles you run in, you're missing that part of the left, which is cool because sometimes I wish I could forget about that part of the left for other reasons. But yeah, I mean, what I would say, I think you're right about PC culture being co-opted by the state. It goes back to what I'm talking about with recuperation, and a lot of so-called PC culture is really, you know, corporate culture with, corporations. They don't want to get sued, so they put in all of these HR policies that are very, they put a nice little bow on it and tape stuff off, but they really are not particularly effective, in my opinion. I think that's a dance that any kind of critical movement has to do, though. Because at the end of the day, you know, I think the personal is political. And as I mentioned, what happens to one person happens to the entire world, and vice versa. An injury to one is an injury to all, the famous anarchist socialist slogan. I feel like one of the things that has been suggested here, like with the Nazis, for instance. Yeah, it is rare, but it is going up. And in fact, in 2018, I think something like 100% of all politically motivated killings were coming from the far right. And that's been steadily increasing ever since 2016 and possibly a little bit before. So it's definitely not the biggest problem in the world, but to Heather Heyer's family, to the families of the people that were killed in Christchurch. I mean, really what happens to one person, it's something that bad when it reverberates out into the world. As I said with Stalin, you know, doing what he did to the USSR, partially because he was beaten as a child. Like, we've really, really got to be careful with that, because we don't know where the karma is going to go. I think the final thing that I would kind of say is, I think anti-imperialism is really, really important. I think that we really do need to continue to be critical and to make the argument for a smarter, more compassionate, more humanistic world. I feel like a lot of the time people on both the left and the right get swept up in different partisan ideas, different ways of looking at the world, and start fighting each other because it's so much harder than to fight the state. But I do think that, as far as pan-anarchism versus classical anarchism, I think to avoid that trap that you mentioned of, in a way, the Republican anti-state line is a recuperation of anti-statism, and they're really taking advantage of, Cold War rhetoric. So, you need a tent post. You need something, a mooring line stuck in the ocean to keep you from drifting too far. And so that's why I think that a lot of the answer to a lot of what we're dealing with is found in classical anarchism. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys for a great debate. This is Todd Lewis to the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.